Okay. So, we're often asked about reincarnation and the Bible. As we begin our studies in Spiritism, we are often faced with the beautiful concept of reincarnation. And when we stop to think about it, reincarnation is such a beautiful, beautiful idea because it shows us the love of God for us as he starts to explain how a soul, a human being, temporarily here in a physical body, can learn with time. And it also begins to explain how we can see many differences in our world, how some are born rich, others not so much, where some have great abilities and others not as many, or sometimes how some have physical ailments and others not. Without the concept of reincarnation, it becomes really difficult for us to reconcile the idea of divine justice if we believe in God, because we see different things in the world. And to think that all of a sudden our lives can be, our eternal lives, so to say, can be determined by a couple of years in a physical plane seems almost mean if you think about it. Can our eternal happiness or eternal lives forever as a spirit be truly determined by 60 years, 70, 100 years on earth? Should a short period of time define eternity? And what happened to those who are born and pass right after their birth? And those simple couple of hours or even minutes, how were they to be judged by God to live in this so-called heaven or so-called hell based on the short amounts of time? It doesn't seem fair. And if we are to think about God, the very definition of fair, of good and just comes to mind. If it's not fair and just and good and all-knowing, then it's probably not God. So reincarnation is that missing link in the sense that help explain how all these different things can happen in short or longer periods of time, because in fact it's not just one life that we go through, but many lifetimes. And what we have not time to do in one lifetime, what we have not time to learn in one lifetime, we'll have a chance to do it again. So reincarnation speaks dearly to our heart because it really brings some joy to our lives and reminds us fundamentally that we can be better people tomorrow. That our actions matter because the actions that we take today in this lifetime will carry on to the next. He helps us guide ourselves when it comes to our behavior here on earth. If there are other lifetimes, then it is beneficial to us to treat others fairly. Because honestly, if there is no life after life, then why should it matter? We could easily get lost in the physical world and really do whatever it takes to get pleasure today at the expense of other people if we do not believe that there is a life after life or many lives after that. So reincarnation helps us really see ahead and say that the investment in goodness that we do today pays off over large amounts of time. It also adds a beautiful new facet to life. The friendships that we make today, the bonds that we connect today, will live on after we pass. And maybe we'll meet them again in the life to come. So reincarnation also promises that our circle of love will always be growing. That life after life, we will grow in the friendship circle and the familial circle, and we'll truly eventually understand the whole concept of family, of divine family. So there are many, many different things that reincarnation brings to us that really brings joy and comfort to our hearts. However, as we begin to look into reincarnation, if we have not already adopted the concept, we are often faced with the idea of our own upbringing in the Western world. And in the Western world, whether we are Christians or not, we're often subjects to a culture that in great part is generated by the Bible, by the New Testament. And I'm not speaking as a religious book in itself. I'm talking about a cultural and historical piece. Everything that we see in our society in one way or another in the Western world tends to be somewhat related to the concept of Christianity. And the concept of Christianity, the Judaical traditions of Christianity, come mainly from what we know as the Bible. So it's also interesting when we begin to do our studies of reincarnation to face the idea that we have to deal with our perceptions of what Christianity is, which were inherited by our acculturation in this Western culture, and reconcile that with the Bible, which we are often told contains no mention whatsoever of reincarnation. So how do we deal with that? So it's an important thing, and it should be interesting. Hopefully, we'll try to make it as pleasant as possible, to look back at the New Testament in specific, to see if there are mentions, instances in there as to the concept of reincarnation. Because sometimes folks really struggle. They say, reincarnation really makes sense to me, but I don't find it in the Bible. Is it in the Bible? And we all have come to accept that the Bible is such an important, powerful document to us that, maybe we should take a look back. So what we hope to do today, with your patience, and I promise I'll try to be as brief as possible, is to look briefly at the New Testament, and I'm going to mainly focus on the New Testament because I find it to be the most interesting part of the Bible. If you think about it, the Bible really is split into two big pieces, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I like to call the New Testament the Old Testament 2.0. Right? We have the 1.0 version, which is before Jesus came, and then after Jesus came, the 2.0 version, the upgrade version, comes in the New Testament. So I focus mainly on the New Testament because I'm particularly very interested by the idea, by the figure, by the concept of the Christ. So we're going to look at that because that's where we find the latest teachings in the Bible, mainly, and because it's a very large book, so we only have a short period of time, we're going to focus there a little bit to see if there are instances in which reincarnation might be actually mentioned in the Bible, to our own surprise. And the one concept to hold today in our mind is a very simple one. When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So hopefully the goal is for us to kind of talk a little bit about reincarnation, expose ourselves to some passages in the New Testament in which there might be a semblance of reincarnation, so that you can then draw your own conclusions. Because ultimately it's about you making your conclusions. I will not get brownie points for convincing you to believe that reincarnation is in the New Testament. And to be quite honest, and I don't mean to be blunt, but probably won't change my life if you believe in it or not. I got to be straightforward with you. But it's great to have a conversation about it and see things in a different ways. Because what we try to do in Spiritism is to look at the facts and arrive at our own conclusions in a logical and rational and reasonable manner. Is that okay? Sounds like a fair deal? Okay. So here's one of the problems about this presentation. Because we're going to talk about the New Testament, there's going to be a lot of words written on the screen. So I'm going to do some reading every once in a while. And depending on time, we will even try to kind of take a look at one of the parables, reevaluated with the idea of reincarnation and how that changes a little bit the meaning of the parable, if we have time. And if it becomes really boring and massive, then maybe we'll skip it. And I'm very glad to see that nobody brought fruits or tomatoes in today into the room. So I think we're going to be very civil and polite. So I appreciate your patience as we go through this. And we can kind of go through the process. How is our timing? Do we have time for questions during, or are we going to wait until the end?
It's up to you.
Okay. So why don't we interact as we go? It's your choice. If you want to hold them into the back and to the end, please do so. If you want to pop them in there. If by any means I think that we're going to go there, I'll tell you, hey, we're going to get there in a little bit. Hang tight. Does that work for you? So hopefully we'll have a conversation here. All right. So, in the beginning, it was the Word, so we're told. It's important for us to then talk about the word reincarnation. It is true that you're not going to find reincarnation in the Bible, reincarnation, because the word was not invented until the 1850s by Allan Kardec. So the word itself will not be in the Bible. However, this is something that people oftentimes don't know, but the word was actually created by Allan Kardec. But however, you might find other concepts that are somewhat related or meshed in with reincarnation, and they're different from each other. So it's always good to start by making sure we differentiate the different words and different things, so we can kind of see how the ideas might be similar or different according to the context. We probably heard of transmigration of the soul, of metempsychosis, or resurrection, of born again. These all hint at something, but they're a tiny little bit different. That's why they're different words. The concept of transmigration of the soul, for instance, is the whole idea of a soul being able to come into another body, but not necessarily an equal body. Right? So the whole concept that we find, for instance, of a human, sometimes we see that in Buddhism, coming back as an animal will be the transmigration of the soul piece, which is something very different than reincarnation, for instance, as Kardec defined it, because reincarnation, in the concept in which it was originally created, was that you cannot regress spiritually. You can always move forward, but you can change life forms to a less evolved life form. So there's a little bit of difference, for instance, there, transmigration of the soul and reincarnation. Metempsychosis, for instance, was also the idea that some Greeks actually had, that it was possible for an old man to go into a young boy's body and almost like steal the body and kind of take it over. So that's a little difficult, a little weird too, right? And a little different. So this is also a different concept altogether. Resurrection, we have been very aware of, is a concept that you live again. Some people have taken it to be the physical resurrection of the body. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about it. But we also have the concept of being born again, which have also religious innuendos nowadays and connotations. But all these words and all these acts, they hint at the idea that there is another phase of life. So whereas we're not going to find reincarnation per se, ipsiletters, like literally on the Bible, these concepts are present and it will be there, especially the one of born again and resurrection, which, is very understandable because the Jewish Hasidic tradition actually believed in reincarnation back in the day. So resurrection sometimes it's an interesting concept to look at, and so is the concept of being born again. So it's a question of semantics. We want to keep an open mind about the words because the words keep changing. And we're going to talk a little bit now about some interesting topics of how the New Testament came to be and the context of the time, and maybe we'll garble our ideas a little bit and see what comes out of it. Have I bored you to death so far? You're with me? This is the abstract part. Let's get into the more interesting piece. All right, context to the New Testament, which I like to call check yourself before you wreck yourself. We are very familiar with the New Testament, the Bible. We probably have one at home. But do we know how it came about? Have we really actually read it? So here's a quiz for you. You don't have to answer it. You can if you want to, but answer it in your own head. How many books are there in the New Testament? Did you know it was more than one book? How many books? Anybody want to take a guess? 27. There are four Gospels, four different perceptions of how things went down. There is one Acts of the Apostles, which is what happened after, which is a lot of mediumship right there. Then we have 21 letters. 13 of each were written by Paul. And we have one apocalypse at the end. So we have a total of 27 books in the New Testament. It's a great way of you reading 27 books at once. You finish that, you can say you read 27. Question number 2. Do you know what language it was written in? Greek. It was not Aramaic, and it was not Hebrew. How do we know? Because the manuscripts that we have, and which everything else came to be, were written in Greek. Which means that a lot of them, to begin with, are not the original, and that they were originally translated from something else. So we're already missing something on the way.
Is that what the concept of the Greek to me?
Yes, quite possible. And those squiggly little things that, it feels like you squished a bug in a book. But it was written in Greek, which is surprising, right? Because we expect Hebrew or Aramaic, but what we know, what scholars know of the New Testament that we have today, was all in Greek. So there's already a translation thing going on there. Do you know when was it written? Yes, that's a good one. Before I was born. I don't know, maybe reincarnation, you had been born before then. But we actually think that, although we're very used to Twitter and blogging and everything else, back in the day they didn't do it, believe it or not. They did not have Twitter or Blogger. So it took them a while to write things. In fact, the first book, the first Gospels and manuscripts that we find were written 20 years after the Christ had passed, around 50 in the Common Era. So we're looking about 20 years of memory there before we have something down on paper. And this is the first one, and they go from 50 to 120. So there's been some time since the story was there. It was really an oral tradition. Who wrote it? Do we know? Who wrote all those books? We call them the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. We have letters Paul and Peter and so forth. But do we know that they were the ones who wrote it? Well, the date should give you an idea, right? The fact that they came much later probably give you an idea that we're not quite sure. In fact, that's right. The historians are not certain that the books the books were written by the people we claim them to have been written. As a matter of fact, some of the historians, by what they found, are pretty sure that some of the letters that we know have been attributed to Paul were not written by Paul at all. But that's a whole different conversation altogether. And the next question for the big prize: how do we know we actually have the New Testament as it's intended to be? Or that we actually reading something that's credible? Well, the only evidence that we really know is that there's been scribes and manuscripts, and that they have been written down by somebody and then manually copied by somebody. No photocopies, no Xerox machines back in the day. So it's literally, you would have to look at something and write it over. And by us finding different pieces of these manuscripts throughout time, we can kind of ascertain the different versions of the documents and see how these different documents have changed through time, which makes it quite interesting because some things change through time. You have one Gospel of Matthew here, and 120 years later you find another manuscript, another Gospel of Matthew, and they're different. Tiny little differences there. We'll talk briefly about that. So it's an interesting concept. So the books that we have come to know as the New Testament have changed throughout time and have been heavily impacted by the hand of man throughout the ages. So it's far from being that literal revelation that we oftentimes think it was. Ready for part number 2? Here's some interesting things that you might not know about the New Testament and I found fascinating when I first read about them. You know the Lord's Prayer that we're also familiar with? It shows in 2 places. It shows up in oh, you can't see that very much, huh? It shows in Luke, and it shows in Matthew as well. But the funny thing is, by comparing those manuscripts over time, we know, I don't know because I'm not a scholar, but the scholars know that there actually has been what they call a harmonization. That through time, as they were copying it, they have added things from Matthew to Luke to make Matthew and Luke look more like they're similar. So that's not uncommon at all. So the early manuscripts of Luke show one thing. A couple of hundred years later, the manuscripts from Luke are like, oh, hey, hold on a second, these are different. But they look a lot like Mark. So somebody decided to be helpful and say, you know what, we should make these a little bit more similar. So let's get some from here. Let's put something over there. Interesting, huh? Part number 2. The adulterous stoning in John, for instance. You guys remember that beautiful passage where, those who have not sinned cast the first stone, and so forth. You know what the funny thing about it is? Until the 12th century, it was not in John at all. So it only starts showing up in John after the 12th century. The manuscripts before the 12th century didn't have the story in John, for instance. Isn't that interesting? Again, it's a case of harmonization of somebody transcribing that and say, you know what? We really need to make these look more like each other. I'm going to get a little piece of this, and I'm going to put it over here. It's a beautiful story nevertheless, so I'm glad that it's in there. We don't know why they did it. We just know that they did it. I'm not going to try to pass judgment on why they did it, but it might have been a very helpful pass. But we know that the scholars know that it has happened. The other interesting piece here is one comment about women being silent in church, which we find in Paul sometimes. I don't know if you've seen it. Some people complain about Paul sometimes, some of the letters being a little bit chauvinistic, a little bit male, and saying that women should be silent in church and not speak a word. Well, the scholars actually think that was a comment in the margins of a book. When you had your copy of the Bible or the New Testament, and it was a really rare and difficult things to have because they're really expensive. They're copied by hand. Not everybody knew how to write. Folks would oftentimes write comments in the margins for themselves. And then those books would get copied by somebody else because you only had a few copies of those. And the scribes who were copying those, which obviously were not that into the work because it was really a boring work of copying things over and over, would sometimes think that those comments were revisions rather than comments. And they would sneak into the new version, copy it afterwards. So there's a couple of those in there as well. There's a funny one too that I think is in, I forgot the letter, but it's a comment saying, "Fool, leave the old meaning in there," like somebody wrote. And then for the next copy, it became part of the text. So it's pretty interesting how it happens. But so this is a very human process, right? We have a copy, we have a scribes transcribing this, and it takes a very long time. It's very intensive. And if you have ever copied a very long word by hand, which probably not all of us have done, but when you hand copy, your mind tends to wander. And so it's not uncommon for you to miss words, do misspellings. There wasn't no punctuation back then, so things change a little bit as well. So it's really a work in progress. Another interesting fact here, the Holy Trinity. We have heard about the Holy Trinity, right? You know what's interesting about the Holy Trinity? It's not found in any manuscript until the 15th century. So that's another instance of something that we hear quite often, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which kind of gets a little tricky because you say that the three are in one, which becomes pantheism a little bit. But the interesting thing is, it's not there until the 15th century. And then 15th century, it starts showing up in manuscripts. And it shows up only once in John. So it's a curious idea when we look historically at the documents that we have, for us to be aware that some of the things that we're reading are already a result of many iterations, of many different changes and translations and so forth. One last one before I bore you to death. We also know, some of the manuscripts, there are 12 extra verses of Mark. Mark ended with the woman fleeing at the end of Jesus' death, and that's it. It ended. Since then, 12 verses have been added and talking about the resurrection. Again, another instance of harmonization where somebody said, "Hey, there's no resurrection in Mark. Maybe we should put some verses in there about it afterwards." They took 12 verses, slap it in there, and now we have a different book. So what am I saying here? Am I bringing down the New Testament and saying it sucks? Absolutely not. That's not what I mean to say at all. It's a fantastic book. It's a collection of books. It's a beautiful work. It's really amazing, I think. But it's important for us to know how it came about, in which context, and how it has changed through time, because it will help us guide our own thoughts as we think about the concept of reincarnation.
One important thing that I learned about the Bible was that it was chosen during the Constantine era.
Yeah, great point. You can't really read this, but the Council of Nicaea in 325, Annus Dominus, was really the common era. It was where they kind of came together and decided what books were going to be there. And they used some interesting concepts as to, it has to be accepted for a lot of people. You have to be from people we know. You have to be pretty orthodox within what we believe. So, this book's not good, this book. So there was a human picking involved here, right? There was no shiny light from the skies and boom, books fall into the ground. As we oftentimes subconsciously we think, right? This is like a divine thing. It's a divine thing in that it came through men, and it was worked through men, by men, for men, with a couple of times. And during the Council of Nicaea, for instance, and later in the 4th century when they picked the books, but in the Council of Nicaea, people were not very happy with a couple of people there, and one of them was Origen, his name was, and he was one of the original founders of the churches of big beliefs during that time. And he was a big believer in, among other things, reincarnation. But because they didn't like him, they had some political falling, so anything that he wrote got sidetracked and got taken out. So basically, that's one of the reasons why we don't find a lot of more explicit mentions to reincarnation, because his work and everything that he taught was pulled out because folks didn't agree to his approach to different things. So there has been a constant change through time, and it's a very human process that we have come to realize in this list of 27 books chosen in the 4th century of our era. So it's really an interesting process. All right, so that's fine, great, context, yada, yada, yada. Let's get to the meat, right? So where can I find some instances, even in this product that has been passed through time and space and people, Are there mentions or hints or implications of reincarnation? Well, there are a couple of cases that we can look at today. One of them is a famous "Who do you say I am?" when Jesus sends some of doubt in his disciples. Another case is when King Herod hears about Jesus and wonder whether he is Elijah or John the Baptist, and we'll talk more about it. Another one is when John the Baptist asks for confirmation that Jesus really is, the Messiah. And then there's a transfiguration piece, which is pretty famous too in the Bible. It's an awesome story. Then there's also an interesting inference when Jesus heals a blind man from birth, and people are trying to find out why is he blind. And finally, we're going to visit again the famous talk to Nicodemus as well about reincarnation. So we're going to dive into a couple of these examples. There are more. We have a limited time, and personally, I have very limited knowledge. So we're going to do what we can with what we have. Is that okay? All right. Let's go into the first one. The famous "Who do you say I am?" So we find this in Matthew, right? In Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 to 16, there says the following. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Because he's sensing some doubt, right? People are like, there's this chatter, this rumor about people, like, let's squash it. Let's kind of deal with it. And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Interesting, huh? So people are saying, he is one of those prophets come again. That is to say, reincarnated. Right? They're talking about it because they accept the idea that there is reincarnation. Again, the word reincarnation is not there because it didn't exist, but you can see, I think rather clearly, there's an indication that people believe that he is one of those prophets come again. And then he turns around and asks Peter, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Right? Because it's a cop-out that Peter gives, right? Oh, people are telling you, people are thinking, but what do you, Peter, think I am? And he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Right? But you see here how interesting it is that it's documented, folks were talking about him being another prophet from before, and the only way that he can be another prophet is if he is reincarnated, because all the prophets have died. Right? So that's one instance in which you can kind of look. This is in Matthew. And we don't know if Matthew looks like that, but he looks very respectable there. Right? And another one is when King Herod hears about Jesus. And he also thinks he could be Elijah or Baptist, right? The Baptist. It says, King Herod heard about this, for Jesus... this is difficult to read, huh? For Jesus' name had become well known. Some said John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are work in him, Jesus. Others said he is Elijah. And still others claimed he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, "John, the man I beheaded, has been raised from the dead." Right? Again, it's an instance of belief of not only showing that King Herod was afraid that the man he had killed had been raised to the dead in another body, right? Because they had, funny enough, the transmigration of the soul thing. John the Baptist and Jesus had lived at the same time, so when John died, it's difficult to explain, but some confusion there. But you can see that it's also indicated here that other folk are saying that he is Elijah coming back, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, right? And this is one is in Mark, and Mark is very thoughtful there. Okay, Mark. That's chapter 6, verses 14, 16. Check it out for yourselves. I know this reading thing is boring, but hopefully we'll lay the foundation for stuff. All right. Another one is John the Baptist. John the Baptist is that great messenger that comes before Christ as voice in the wilderness telling that the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming. Great man, fantastic prophet in his own right. The interesting thing is that even that great man, with that great message and work at him, had a doubt at one point in time. He was arrested. When eventually he was arrested, before he dies, he asked some of his followers to really go ask Jesus if he was really the Messiah, right? Because he has his doubts too sometimes, right? We're human, we have our doubts. I think this is a beautiful story because it connects us to this folkloric creatures that we think are very far away. But like us, he was human and he had doubts. So he's going to go and check on them. So he asked for some of his disciples to go and search out the Christ and check him out because he's arrested. He can't go anywhere. And then they go out and they find Jesus, and they're listening to Jesus. And Jesus then notices their presence and starts talking. And he says, "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist." What an honor, right? Jesus is telling you, of all the great prophets, none has been greater than John the Baptist. And yet John the Baptist has a little bit of a doubt. Right? Isn't that fantastic? It brings hope to us. I mean, they're not far away from who we are. We can get there. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesies until John. And if you're willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So here is now Jesus saying that John the Baptist is actually Elijah, reincarnated, coming for the message, which is interesting. Again, another instance in which you might find direct mention of reincarnation. Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, has been long dead. Now he comes and do this. Another interesting fact here is in good old infomercial style, but if you still remain seated in the next 10 minutes, you also get 2 more examples. Transfiguration. This is that beautiful passage in which Jesus picks Peter, James, and John to go up the mount with him, and on the top of the mountain, after a day or so of meditation, they see the vision of Moses and also John the Baptist together, right? And they come down later, and people are really. And actually, the funny thing is that disciples want to stay there. They are such in a great atmosphere. They've meditated. They don't want to come down the hill and go back to their camp. And they even suggest, maybe we can build a little tent here. We can all stay here. This is so great. And Jesus says, no, it's important for us to go back. They really do. You should. It's really great. And Jesus says, no. We need to go back to our people, which is a beautiful symbology in its own. Even when you rise up the world, on top of the world, and you're in greater communion with all things sacred, you can't just stay there. You need to make your way back into the world and help the world. It's a beautiful message. Anyways, I digress, because I do that all the time. And here's the passage from Matthew as well. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Some prophecy going on there, right? Don't tell anybody. But are you not going to tell anybody after you see that? Here it is, written. The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" And Jesus replied, because they're seeing there, but they didn't see Elijah over there on top, right? But the Old Testament says Elijah will come back first before the Messiah comes. It's part of the Old Testament prophecy. And then Jesus replies, "To be sure, Elijah has come and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Interesting sentence at the end. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to him about John the Baptist. So Elijah, again, another instance of Elijah being John the Baptist. John the Baptist being the reincarnation of Elijah. Of course, one interpretation to this could be a symbolic, poetic interpretation of saying, well, it wasn't really reincarnation. It was just that John the Baptist was doing the job of Elijah, and then symbolically speaking, that's why he came. But you see many different things. You believe, or would you like to believe? One good thing is to see that there's a lot of different mentions in there about this idea of reincarnation, right? There's also Transfiguration Part 2, which really is in the Gospel of Mark this time. To be sure, Elijah does come first and restore all things. Why then it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wish, just as is written about him. So a different source, a different gospel, again, validating the same thing, without that beautiful sentence at the end saying that they understood, because it's kind of implicit here. But the funny thing is, this I think is really, really curious. A description of John the Baptist in Matthew 3:4 says, "John's clothes were made of camel's hair, and he had a leather belt around his waist." Camel's hair, not exactly like the most, undercover situation, right? And here's a description of Elijah in Kings in the Old Testament. He was a man with a garment of hair and with a leather belt around his waist. Thought it was interesting. Not that it tells you anything, let's be honest, but I thought it was curious and I figured I would share, right? Because anybody could be hairy, have hairy clothes and a leather belt. I'm wearing a leather belt today, and I'm quite hairy. Here, not here. But I thought it was interesting for us to kind of mention it out there that we see some similarities with time. So we see it in Matthew and we see it in Mark, the transfiguration piece. And there's an also interesting piece now here in John, in the Gospel of John chapter 9, where they find, the disciples are walking with the Christ and they find a blind man, right? And he's blind from birth. So he was born blind. And the disciple asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Here's an interesting thing because, part of a lot of some of the traditions of the time believed that the sins of the father will be passed to the sins of the son, right? So, he was born blind, so he didn't do anything. So it must have been his parents, right? How was he born blind? Was kind of a question. And then Jesus responds, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. So neither is a sin from before nor his parents. It was a choice in this incarnation for him to render an example of how great it is to be healed. Right? Its implication is not a direct relation, but I thought it was interesting because it gets at the idea of that the folks at that time were very clear about the idea of reincarnation and coming and cause and consequence. Like who was responsible for him being blind from birth? Right? So they knew that it wasn't just a happenstance, that it has a reason to it, that that it preceded somehow something either that he did in a past life or his parents did. So it's very, very interesting to see that as well in John. All right. Another example, one that we're very familiar with most of the times, a great dialogue. And when it's Nicodemus comes. Nicodemus is a doctor of the law. He is in the Sanhedrin. He's one of the great doctors of Jewish law at the time. Think about the Supreme Court of Judaism of the time. He was one of the members. They had a lot of members, but he was one of them. At night, interesting enough, but he comes and he sees Jesus because he doesn't want to be seen. But to his credit, what we are able to read and discern, Nicodemus was really a level-headed person and really interested in knowing the truth. So he goes for political reasons at night and seeks the Christ to really ask him, because he's been hearing all these things and he thinks there might be something there about him being something special. And he understands clearly the concept of that there has been talk of reincarnation and being born again, right? Which today means something a little bit different than probably they intended at the time. So he seeks out Jesus, and then the conversation goes according to the Gospel of John. In reply, Jesus declared, I tell you the truth. No one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. This is where we get the whole religious connotation nowadays of being born again, right? But it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what they were saying. Great question by Nicodemus, so everybody should ask this, right? But how can a man be born again when he is old? Nicodemus asked. Surely he cannot enter a second time into his mother's womb to be born, right? Have you seen the size of this? Right? It doesn't work. And Jesus answers, I tell you the truth, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he's born of the water and of the Spirit. Which is fascinating because remember the water breaking, the whole concept of water, being born of the water, the physical birth, right? And we being mainly made of, our bodies being mainly made of water. Thanks for your patience. And then he continues, flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to the Spirit. You see, so your spirit doesn't come when the body starts. It's there before. Because flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit comes from the Spirit. So it's not that your soul begins when you are born. It's been there before. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. This is beautiful, I think, very poetic. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everybody born in the Spirit. You can hear me talking, I'm a spirit, but you can't see my spirit. You don't know where it came from yet. It's there. How can this be, Nicodemus asked, which is great, right? Nicodemus really wants to understand. He's really trying to get down to the base. I find him fascinating. What a fascinating man. Because he really wants to understand. And Jesus replies, you are Israel's teacher, because remember the Sanhedrin was the doctors of the law and supposed to know everything. And you do not understand these things? I tell you the truth, we speak of what we know, and we testify to what we have seen, but still you people do not accept our testimony. I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe it. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? Right? If he's talking about charity in the physical world and being kind to each other, people are not accepting that and being difficult with that part and still trying to create different camps and fight, how will we understand these things like the wind that we cannot see? So let's get the basics figured out before we go into the more complicated parts. But I find it fascinating, right? That it goes on. Going back to Nicodemus here, kudos to Nicodemus, to the good old Nick, for going out and seeking it out, seeking that answer in there. But I think that what is great to see here is that these different instances that we talked about, there's 6 different cases, are examples of places in which you could make an argument that reincarnation is not only found in the New Testament under a different name, because again, the name reincarnation wasn't there, the word, but that there was a common belief at the time revolving around reincarnation, as we can see witnesses by the questions and so forth. But okay, so we've got all of this, but what I truly find fascinating is that all of this and the way that the New Testament came to be, the way that it was brought together, points to the fact that we cannot take things literally with those books, because they've been changed over time. They've been translated from different languages. They have been written 20 years after the fact, the earliest we have, and they have been harmonized and changed by the people who are transcribing those. So clearly we cannot take everything literally, because translations and changes and everything else is really hard. What we got to do is try to understand the meaning of it. And so the same goes with the word reincarnation. You're not going to, if you're looking for validation to reincarnation by looking and finding the word reincarnation there, you're not going to find it. You're going to have to deal with the fact that's not there. But the funny thing I think is beautiful here is every good code kind of has a clue inside the code on how to read the own code. And I find here in the second letter to Corinthians that Paul says, I think it's a beautiful sentence, he has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. If we focus on the little mini itty-bitty letters and try to take things personally, it would only create divisiveness. We only be divided among ourselves, because we will interpret things so different because we come from different backgrounds, and we will be stuck on that and we won't accept anything else. But if we try to understand things in spirit, right, by the meaning of it, the overall meaning of the passage or the context of the times, chances are we will be happier in arriving in our own conclusions. Which I think is really, really interesting and really great, because it's a 2,000 years old invitation for us to be reflective about the context and the way that things come about. For us not to look at the words, but to kind of think about the whole in general. And I find it very interesting that we also find in the third question of the Spirit School, question number 3, when there's a question about is God infinite, what it is, the Spirit tells us, human speech is too impoverished and insufficient to define that which transcends human intelligence. What do I mean by that? There's a subtle reminder to that which Jesus was telling Nicodemus before. Like, I'm trying to tell you the basics here, and you don't even get that. So getting the really difficult things, it's way harder for you. So we can't just attain ourselves at words, because our language is oftentimes insufficient to translate thought or what we mean. Don't we do that ourselves in our daily lives? Don't sometimes we say something thinking that people will understand a certain way and they understand it completely different? The words as the vehicle of thought are still very imprecise things. So we have to be very careful about measuring our words, how we say things and how to interpret things, which is also a great invitation in a way for us to be considerate of other people's words. When they say something that rubs us the wrong way, we say, hey, words are not always perfect. Maybe he meant something else. Maybe she meant something else. Let me ask him, what did you mean by this? Let's do a Nicodemus. Let's ask more questions. Say, what do you mean by this? I want to be sure, right? So the shortcomings of language are a really interesting piece that we got to be aware when we look back to the New Testament or whatever it is to really think about things, especially when it comes to reincarnation. I really wanted to kind of mention briefly the parable of the talents that we find in two different places. We find it in Matthew and we find it in Luke. Let's kind of go over briefly because we're running a little bit tight on time in general. But basically, the idea here, let's go at it. Let's go at it. I think we have a little bit of time, right? So would you guys be okay if I read the parable and then we talk a little bit about it? It's a little big, but okay. I think with reincarnation, it offers us a new perspective to it. For it will be like, this is in Matthew, right? For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them his property. To one, he gave 5 talents, little coins at the time, talents, 5 talents to one. To another, 2, and to another, 1. So 5, 2, and 1. 3 people, right? To each according to his ability. Right? Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent and so also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Right? We all know the story. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and sat on accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Right? So you took care of 5, which was not that much. For him it was, I will give you more. Enter into joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground, where you have what is yours. Here, have what's yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reaped where I have not sown, and gathered where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it. So he take the talent from him and give it to those who had the 10 talents. For everyone who has will be more. Who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Hardcore stuff. Let's review this really quickly, right? 3 people and a boss, right? Boss comes and says, Hey, I'm going to be away for a little bit. I want you to take care of what I have. You get 5 talents. Please take care of the 5 coins. You get 2 coins. Please take care of the 2 coins. You got 1 coin. Please take care of the 1 coin. Why 5? Why did he give that person 5 and that person 2 and that person 1? Well, because they have different abilities. So he trusted more to those who had more abilities to kind of do that, which in itself is kind of a beautiful thing, right? The more you have, the more you will be trusted with. What happened? Lord goes away. The master goes away. The guy that had 5 coins goes into the market, trades with people, right? An act of trading, interacting with people. He makes more. He makes 10. From 5 to 10. He doubles it. The one that has 2, likewise, goes out, does different things, comes back with 4. So he also doubles it, right? The one that had 1, what does he do? interesting enough, he has a really funny idea of God. He thinks God is a very mean-spirited and a very hard man. So he's afraid of God, right? And he buries his talent in the ground so nobody would take it away. The master comes back and says, okay, what have you done with my coins, with my talents? The one that had 5 steps up first. Interesting that he steps up first, right? He's got more responsibility. He steps up to the place first and he says, you given me 5, I'll give you 5 back. They are all yours, 10, right? And the master says, great. Actually, you keep those 10. The other one comes with 2, steps up next and says, you gave me 2. I made them into 4. Here they are, the 4. Right? Nobody asked for a commission, by the way. Interesting, huh? Right? No, it's like, right, you could have given the 5 and keep the 5. Nobody did that. It's very human, right, for us to do it. And it's great joy. And he receives the same treatment. Isn't that interesting? Of the one with 5. Because the one with 5 is like, hey, you had 5, you doubled it, you made 10, right? 10 is more than 4. I like 6 more than 4, right? So even the other one doubling it, which was a great job, he's still like a lot less than, right, what he was. But he treats them the same, which is a beautiful idea of how he goes. Third guy is a little scared. He comes with all kinds of excuses, right? Oh, I knew you're really tough. I was afraid. I know that you're a hard man, that you're always looking for more. So I was afraid. I hid it. I hid the talent. Now here it is one. And then the master says, well, you should have at least have invested and give it with interest, right? So take that away, give it to the one that has 10. Now he's got 11, right? And you go into suffering, right? The dark place. So there's many beautiful moral lessons in there for us in general, right? We can see the importance of working and everything else, and so forth and so forth. And we can kind of spend a couple of hours talking about the psychological, how people are thinking and who they go about different things. But what I want to suggest here is an interesting aspect, which is, why did one get 5, one got 2, and one got 1? They had different abilities. They had to come from somewhere. Reincarnation kind of comes in there. But I also want to suggest something here, which is, which of those are we? What if I told you that one way to interpret it is that we are all of them? We begin as being the one with 1. As we come back and we develop more abilities, we become the one with 2. And as we come back again with 5, we begin to think differently. We begin by being very scared and fearful of God. So we hide our talents. We think God is like us, is going to punish us. And in fact, we end up punishing ourselves the way we think God's going to punish us. Or we punish others the same way, right? You sinful person, you. Then after we learn a couple of times, we come back and we have 2 talents. Like we doubled, like we went from 1, we went to 2. But we doubled it to 4. Wouldn't it make sense then the next time we'll come with 4? Why is there one with 5? It's a prettier number. I don't know, but one suggestion is, as we learn and grow, kind of like an exponential life, we keep growing exponentially and learning more. God also trusts us with more as is to challenge us. You could handle 4 last time. Now you're going to try 5. I'm going to give you an extra one for you to excel and so forth. But that is only possible if we understand the progression of things. And the only way that we can understand the progression of things is by really embracing reincarnation. There is no other way to explain in a long-term approach why one started out with 5 on this parable and one started out with 1. Only if we look back into many lifetimes we would have seen that the one with 5 was really eventually, back in the day, one with 1. Right? So reincarnation, not that it changes the meaning of the parable, it just adds another layer to it for us to kind of think about. And not only does it do that, but it also adds a certain kindness to the parable, because generally when we read about it, we get either really biffed up with the servant that did 1, like, what the hell, everybody's doubling and you're like lazy, right? Or we get really mean with the master, saying, how mean are you? You're going to throw the guy in a place where there's whipping and gnashing of teeth? Neither are true. We become kinder when we get reincarnation, because we understand that we all three of them, and that we could be in that position too, and that in fact we were, or we are in that position, so we become a little bit more tolerant. And we also realize that the master is not treating him differently. It's treating him the way he thinks the master is going to treat him, which is really him treating himself that way, right? Because he says, I know that you're a hard man that reaps where you do not sow. Like, what kind of assumptions were that, right? He just gave you talents to begin with. So it's an interesting thing how reincarnation, in that sense, opens a door. I'm not saying that this is the correct interpretation of the parables. It's up to you to interpret. I'm offering you a vision for you to see how once we look at the New Testament and we read it again with eyes of potentially considering reincarnation, the parables can have a different flavor to them. And so can have the parables, for instance, of the workers of the last hour, which is another interesting parable too. But so reincarnation was a concept that was at that time very ingrained there and that we ought to continuously look at. And that's why we say that Spiritism is a progressive body of knowledge, because our goal as we learn Spiritism is to constantly look at things differently and learn different things. It's a science that deals with the nature, origin and destiny of spirits, as well as their relation to the corporeal world, as Allan Kardec described in a little book, What is Spiritism? Which means we have to be, when we're talking about Spiritism, very interested in the relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world. And that can only truly be understood through reincarnation, right? The constant progress. And we have to continuously, like a science, move on and think about things. So we need to revisit a lot of those concepts, a lot of those ideas that we had previously held, and see, where did I get that from? How did I get here? Why did I get here? Should I really hold these beliefs? Should I look at things differently? That's up to you. But what I want to say, and what I really mean to say here, is when we look at the New Testament, which is a fantastic book, a work of amazing status, because it offers so many great insights, whether they were truly written by the people who wrote them or not, whether they are really correct or not, we can make lemonade out of any lemons, right, that life throws us. There's beautiful messages in there that tells us about the existence of this great soul that came to enlighten us. But what I find fascinating is that oftentimes we miss. We're often, when we try to interpret things literally, we're often looking for the one explanation. This is the right way or the wrong way, because we can blame others, we write that kind of stuff. We feel better about ourselves. But it's important to remember that there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So there are 4 different witnesses at different times who fundamentally write about sometimes the same thing, sometimes different things, but they have 4 different approaches. One is very Jewish-centric. One is very miracle-centric. Luke talks about the miracles. He was a doctor. He was interested in that kind of stuff. One is very Gentile and Roman-centric. And the other one, John, is very mystical in general. So we have 4 different approaches. And I find that divinity was at work here by giving us 4 different perspectives to look into. Not that we choose one, which we may, but to understand how they come together and how they don't come together. To expand our minds to the idea that we have to triangulate meaning. We have to go over there, read a little bit, and kind of think about it. We have to go over there, read a little bit, think about it. How does this two interact? Oh, there's a third one over there. And now I need to go over here, get the third one, bring it together, and make meaning of all that. Meaning to you. Not to anybody else. So it's beautiful that the New Testament gives us that training grounds that we so often forget because we are so focused on the physical, literal piece of it. So I think that the really great message here is that it's your choice. Make the most of it. Go out and interpret it the way you want it to, that brings fulfillment and joy to you, that you can understand it. Because when we do that, we can really reevaluate history's bestseller. I don't know if you know this, but the bestseller in the world really is not J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, although I'm a fan. It really is the Bible. It's the book most published out there. So let's reevaluate its message based on this triangulation that we were talking about, on these different things. That there are different things that we have to put effort into. When somebody tells you this is right, this is wrong, it makes it really easy for us because we're a little bit lazy sometimes. Oh, this is what's right, this is wrong. I don't have to kind of think and struggle with getting multiple things at once and making sense of it. But that's what we have to do. We have to struggle with those thoughts and different things together and make our own sense to it. And once we reevaluate that message that we're hearing, that Christian Judaic tradition that we keep hearing, and we say, hey, hold on a second. Where does that come from? I'm thinking a little bit different. I am sure and I'm convinced that you will see a whole different cosmology, a whole different way of looking at Christ, which I think Christ has been kidnapped by some theologies. You look at things differently. You say, wow, this is not exactly what I'm hearing other people tell me about this guy, or I'm not interpreting it exactly this way. Whatever works for you, make sure you investigate, you vet it, you hold it in your mind, and you really consider it. That you maybe can have a chance to go back to the New Testament, or whatever other work that you find interesting that points to aspirational things. Look at it again and say, I need to make sure I'm considering that perspective in my life. And ultimately, it has to come down to making better choices. Once we revise this and we have a new way of looking at the world, right, with reincarnation taken in, and now hopefully making it a little bit easier for us to reconcile that whole idea that we had of the Bible, the New Testament, with these new ideas that we're now having about reincarnation, see that they're not mutually exclusive, that they actually mesh, that they've been there all along, and that for historical reasons have kind of fallen apart a little bit, and they have been kind of shoved onto us by culture and by our own passive tendencies, because it's nobody else's fault but our own, because we took it in, right? That we can reevaluate the message and make better choices today, because if there is reincarnation, then today I can make a choice that will be better for me tomorrow. So let's do that. Let's make sure that we think about the long-term approach of things. Let's be kinder to each other today. Let's be more tolerant with each other's words and actions today, because we know that we will meet them again, if not in this lifetime, in the next. So if you know this, why wouldn't you be happier? Why wouldn't you be kinder and lighter about yourself? Don't be too hard on yourself. You will have time to work on yourself and improve yourself. Don't hold yourself back by saying, oh my God, I'm such a horrible person. I don't know how to do anything right. You have as many chances as you need to, so work on a positive. Let's move forward. Make better choices today so that we can have a better future tomorrow. And when we do that, and when we do look at things a little bit different and they change, I'm always reminded of a beautiful, another part of John that says, you know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And it will set you free for yourself. Whatever your truth ought to be, whatever it is that you arrive at, once you find something that's powerful, meaningful, and good, it will create that sense of joy of saying, wow, I'm really seeing things different. My life, it's a little bit lighter and a little bit easier. It won't necessarily solve all the world's problems or your life's problems, but hopefully by revisiting the concept of reincarnation and revisiting the idea of the New Testament and revisiting the idea of the Christ who embodies so many beautiful things and beautiful concepts that have been hijacked by different people trying to get their own agenda figured out, you too will feel light and better about knowing that you are a creature of God, you are loved by God, you will have as many chances as you take, you have many, many, many friends both in the incarnate and discarnate planes of life who are cheering for you, who are happy about you, and that you should never, ever feel lonely. Because even if you feel lonely now, there are those who have lived with you before on this side cheering you on. May we never forget that, and I hope that more and more we can have great conversations about what is it that we believe, why do we believe, in an accepting and kind manner that adds to the lives of all those. Thank you very much. I'll take questions if you have them.